Join me as I try to break down the pseudo-certainty effect in the simplest way possible. Let's see if I can make this concept easy to understand. The pseudo-certainty effect is a fascinating cognitive bias that affects how we perceive risk and reward in uncertain situations. Put simply, it's the tendency to treat uncertain outcomes as if they were certain, and that can have a significant impact on our decision-making. When we're faced with uncertainty, our brains want to find ways to make sense of it. And one way we do this is by oversimplifying complex situations and turning them into simple, binary choices. This can be damaging because it leads us to overestimate the likelihood of certain outcomes and underestimate the risks. Take gambling, for example. Studies have shown that people tend to overestimate their chances of winning, even when the odds are stacked against them. This is because our brains are wired to focus on the potential reward rather than the potential risk. This effect can also play out in investment scenarios. Imagine you're considering putting your money into a hot new stock that's been on the rise. Your brain might tell you that it's a sure thing, that it's going to keep going up and up. But of course, that's rarely the case. The reality is that investing always involves some degree of uncertainty. And when we ignore that uncertainty, we open ourselves up to getting burned. The consequences of the pseudo-certainty effect can be severe. It can lead us to take on excessive risk, to make impulsive decisions, and to ignore warning signs. And it's not just limited to high-stakes situations like gambling or investing. It can affect our daily decisions, from choosing which route to take to work to deciding which health insurance plan to choose. So why do our brains do this? Why do we tend to crave certainty in uncertain situations? One reason is that our brains are wired to respond to threats, and uncertainty can feel like a threat to our survival. When we're faced with uncertainty, our brains go into fight or flight mode, and that can lead us to make rash decisions. Another reason is that we tend to rely on mental shortcuts, or heuristics, to make decisions quickly. These shortcuts can be helpful in many situations, but they can also lead us astray when it comes to uncertain outcomes. We might rely on vivid memories of past successes. For example, rather than considering the full range of possibilities, research has shown that the pseudo-certainty effect is particularly pronounced when we're under time pressure, or when we're feeling stressed or anxious. In those situations, our brains are even more likely to rely on mental shortcuts and oversimplify complex decisions, and that can lead to some pretty disastrous consequences. One key insight that's worth highlighting is that the pseudo-certainty effect can actually be beneficial in certain situations. When we're faced with a complex decision, our brain's tendency to oversimplify can actually help us make a decision more quickly. The problem is when we start to mistake that oversimplification for reality. When we forget that the outcome is still uncertain, that's when we get into trouble. The pseudo-certainty effect has been studied extensively in the field of behavioral economics. One famous study, for example, showed that people were more likely to take on a risky investment if they were presented with a 70% chance of success rather than a 30% chance of failure. The reality, of course, is that those two scenarios are identical, but our brains treat them very differently. So what can we do to counteract the pseudo-certainty effect? The key is to recognize when our brains are oversimplifying complex situations and to take a step back. We need to remind ourselves of the uncertainty involved and consider the full range of possibilities. That can be tough, especially when we're under pressure or feeling stressed, but it's essential if we want to make better decisions. That's it for today's video on the pseudo-certainty effect. I hope you learned something new and useful. If you have any experiences with this bias, or if you've got any questions, please leave them in the comments below. And if you want to learn more about cognitive biases and decision-making, I've got a video on the availability heuristic that you might want to check out. Thanks for watching.